The 9,552nd meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Israel, Qatar, and Tunisia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I propose that the Council invite the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine to the United Nations to participate in this meeting, in accordance with the Provisional Rules of Procedure and the previous practice in this regard. There being no objection, it is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. Members of the Council have before them Document S/2024/173, the text of a draft resolution submitted by Algeria. The Council is ready to proceed to the vote on the draft resolution before it. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements before the vote. I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. My sincere appreciation for your efforts in convening this meeting to deliberate and take action on the draft resolution S 2024-173. The draft resolution under consideration is the culmination of extensive discussions among Council members. As the primary custodian of international peace and security, the Security Council cannot afford passivity in face of the call for a ceasefire in Gaza. By presenting this text, our intention is to empower the Council to fulfill its mandate and protect lives, commencing with an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Ample time have been afforded for Council members to deliberate on the content of the text. Our approach involved meticulous consideration of received proposal and amendment, resulting in what we believe is a balanced text, capable of garnering broad support. The draft resolution underscores key elements, including 1. A humanitarian ceasefire. 2nd, unhindered aid delivery to all parts of the Gaza Strip. 3rd, rejection of forced displacement of Palestinians. 4, compliance with provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. And 5th and last, the imperative for all parties to respect their obligations under international humanitarian law. Madam President, throughout this process, we have heard calls to give time to a parallel track. in order to preserve its chances, with concern raised that any action from the Council would jeopardize this effort. However, almost 1 month after the ICG orders, signs of hope are still absent for improvement of the situation in Gaza. Silence. Silence, we contend, is not a viable option. Now is the time for action and the time for truth. Madam President, members of the Security Council bear the responsibility of voting in favor of measures that uphold international peace and security. This resolution is a stance for truth and humanity, standing against the advocates for murder and hatred. A vote in favor of this draft resolution is a support to the Palestinians' right to life. Conversely, voting against it implies an endorsement of the brutal violence and collective punishment inflicted upon them. A positive vote for the draft brings hope for hundreds of thousands of children to return to school and enjoy their right to education. Conversely, voting against the draft resolution is a vote in favor of annihilating their dream for a better life. A vote in favor of the draft resolution stands in solidarity with the right of Palestinian women, while opposing it means to accept degrading practices that destroy their dignity. Furthermore, supporting the draft resolution means endorsing the Palestinian right to food. Rejecting it constitutes, however, an approval of starvation as mean of war against hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. A vote in favor of the draft is a defense of the right to health, while voting against it is an approval of violation of hospital sanctity and an announced death of those who escaped it in the first place. Madam President, the Council must not merely call for a ceasefire. It must ensure steadfast adherence by all parties. The international community must act swiftly, as the value of ceasefire diminishes with each passing moment. We are rapidly approaching a critical juncture where the call to halt the machinery of violence will lose its significance. Today, every Palestinian is a target for death, extermination, and genocide. We should ask ourselves how many innocent lives must be sacrificed before the Council deems it necessary to call for a ceasefire. For us, and I hope for all the security members, I hope for all the Security Council members, Palestinians, Palestinian lives matter. Each one of us decide where to stand in this tragic chapter of history. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Colleagues, for months, the United States has tirelessly pushed toward a goal that all of us should aspire to: a sustainable resolution of the Gaza conflict so that Israelis and Palestinians can live side by side and enjoy equal measures of security, dignity, and freedom. To build towards that future, the United States is working on a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, along with Egypt and Qatar. This hostage deal would bring an immediate and sustained period of calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks, and from there, we could take the time to build a more enduring peace. President Biden has had multiple calls in recent days with Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as the leaders of Egypt and Qatar, to push this deal forward. And though gaps remain, the key elements are on the table so that if an arrangement is reached, it would help create the conditions for sustainable cessation of hostilities, which I know all of us would like to see. Of course, we want this deal to happen as soon as possible, as is shown by our exhaustive efforts. But sometimes hard diplomacy takes more time than any of us might like. Believe me, I understand the desire for the Council to act urgently, to positively shape the situation in line with the Security Council's mandate. Still, that desire cannot blind us to the reality of the situation on the ground. It cannot come at the expense of undermining the only, and let me repeat, the only path available toward a longer, durable peace. And that is why you've heard me say over and over again, any action this Council takes right now should help, not hinder these sensitive and ongoing negotiations. And we believe that the resolution on the table right now would, in fact, negatively impact those negotiations. Demanding an immediate, unconditional ceasefire without an agreement requiring Hamas to release the hostages will not bring about a durable peace. Instead, it could extend the fighting between Hamas and Israel, extend the hostages' time in captivity, an experience described by former hostages as hell, and extend the dire humanitarian crisis Palestinians are facing in Gaza. None of us want that. And so I reiterate the United States' belief that while numerous parties engage in sensitive negotiations, this is not the time for this resolution, which jeopardizes these efforts. Colleagues, I communicated our concerns publicly and privately over the last several weeks. We've submitted numerous rounds of edits. All were ignored. And so for that reason, the United States has offered an alternative resolution that would do what this text does not: pressure Hamas to take the hostage deal that is on the table and help secure a pause that allows humanitarian assistance to reach Palestinian civilians in desperate need. Again, there's much more we all agree on, and the alternative resolution put forward by the United States is rooted in those shared beliefs. To start, in line with President Biden's comments last week, our text calls for a temporary ceasefire in Gaza as soon as practicable, based on the formula of all hostages being released. Last I checked, no one here opposes this. A majority of us also agree that it's time for this council to condemn Hamas. We know because you provided that feedback to Russia on its PRST and to Algeria on its resolution, a feedback that was inexplicably ignored. Should the U.S. resolution be adopted, it would be the first to condemn Hamas for the abhorrent attacks of October 7th, including the sexual violence documented that day. The U.S. text also makes clear that Hamas has no place in future governance of Gaza, nor does Hamas represent the dignity or self-determination of the Palestinian people. Again, all things I believe we agree on. In addition, our draft states there can be no reduction of territory in the Gaza Strip and rejects, as we have before in Resolution 2720, any forced displacements of civilians in Gaza. It also highlights the concerns many council members have regarding the fate of civilians in Rafah, making clear that under current circumstances, a major ground offensive into Rafah should not proceed. Colleagues, this is not, as some members have claimed, an American effort to cover for an imminent ground incursion. Rather, it is a sincere statement of our concern for the 1.5 million civilians who've sought refuge in Rafah. Civilians must be protected and have access to humanitarian assistance and basic services. On that note, our text outlines a path for implementation of Resolution 2712 and 2720, including provisions that call for the expansion of aid at scale. It also further clarifies and strengthens the mandate of the Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator for Gaza, Sigrid Kaag, whose plan I know we all support. As in previous resolutions, it places an emphasis on the protection of civilians and humanitarian workers, and it calls for lifting all barriers to the provision of humanitarian assistance, opening additional humanitarian routes, and keeping current border crossings open. Our draft also aims to support the Secretary General's effort to investigate those UNRWA personnel who directly participated in October 7th, and it supports the work of the independent review group led by Catherine Colonna, focused on ensuring UNRWA's neutrality. These and other steps are necessary to restore donor confidence. Finally, and as always, the draft reiterates our unwavering commitment to the vision of the two-state solution, where two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, live side by side in peace, within secure and recognized borders, under a revamped and revitalized Palestinian Authority. Colleagues, this resolution reflects the many ideas that have been shared over the past month, but which are not reflected in the text before us today. And we believe it will both support the ongoing negotiations and lay the groundwork for a sustainable peace in the region. But in addition to getting the what of this text correct, we also know it's critical to get the how and when of it right, too. We will work in earnest in negotiating this text, and indeed intend to leave time for everyone to comment rather than impose an arbitrary deadline for the vote. Colleagues, we're at a pivotal moment and a critical one. Critical for the hostages who've been held captive for nearly 20 weeks in Gaza, and critical for their families who are desperate to be reunited with their loved ones. Critical for Palestinians whose homes and families have been destroyed and who now wonder where they'll find their next meal. Critical for Israelis, many of whom are still displaced or face barrages of rocket fire. Critical for Palestinian civilians in the West Bank who are at heightened risk of extremist settler violence. Critical for humanitarian workers and journalists who put their lives on the line every day to do their jobs. And critical to everyone who desperately want to see sustainable peace in this region. That includes, I believe, every single person in this room. And so let us commit to doing this the right way and at the right time so that we can create the right conditions for a safer, more peaceful future. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, for the 5th month now in Gaza, an unprecedented violence has been unleashed in Gaza, the magnitude of which has surpassed any conflict that humankind has encountered following the Second World War. The number of the dead civilians has reached the shocking threshold of 30,000 people, and these are only estimates. In all of this time, the United Nations Security Council has been unable to adopt a critically important resolution with a demand for an immediate ceasefire. I wish to recall that on the 16th of October last year, when Russia proposed the very first draft resolution with this call, the number of the dead Palestinians were approximately 1,000 people. At that point, Western delegations at the Council preferred to abstain en masse in order not to incur the ire of Washington. Colleagues, it will be no exaggeration to state that this new figure, more than 28,000 dead, is the cost of that very first disgraceful inaction. This is the collective responsibility of Western delegations at the Security Council, for whom solidarity within NATO transcends any lofty national declarations on commitment to international humanitarian law, the protection of civilians, and humanitarian personnel. Since then, the United States 3 times exercised the right to the veto, exercised their veto in order to prevent the Council's adoption of demands for a ceasefire. Each time, we heard from the U.S. delegation those same duplicitous and hypocritical calls to just wait a little bit longer, to give time for their allegedly effective diplomacy on the ground. However, this did not yield any results ultimately, and it could not yield any results because the real goal of Washington is not to achieve peace in the Middle East, not to protect civilians, but rather to advance their geopolitical agenda, demanding at any cost for their closest Middle East ally to be shielded. This is why Washington, having pushed through in Security Council Resolution 2720 an effective license to kill for Israel, to kill Palestinians on the occupied Palestinian territory under the pretext of, I quote, establishing conditions for cessation of hostilities, which is something we warned about, continues to provide international cover for the authorities of Western Jerusalem and uphold their impunity for myriad crimes against the people of Gaza. Distinguished colleagues, the delegation of Algeria, on behalf of the Arab group, proposed a robust, balanced draft resolution, at the heart of which is a long-anticipated ceasefire. Our colleagues, our Algerian colleagues, organized negotiations in good faith, conscientiously. They consulted with all delegations, and they strove to take their remarks into account, and we wish to highlight in particular the professionalism shown by our Algerian negotiating team. However, the U.S. delegation this time, from the very beginning, effectively put forward an ultimatum demanding a halt to work on the document. Our U.S. colleagues asserted that the draft proposed by Algeria was dangerous insofar as it would obstruct so-called delicate diplomacy on the ground. We just heard the same in this hall. We call on all of you to consider the cynicism of this argument. Effectively, Washington has been proclaiming that the Security Council of the United Nations is in the way of its plans and demanding that the Security Council, not interfere in the U.S.'s plans. And my U.S. colleague just yesterday publicly stated that they would vote against the Algerian draft. Distinguished colleagues, the United States time and time again has been demonstrating utter disregard both for international institutions and multilateral diplomacy and international law. Today, essentially, the authority and the standing of the United Nations Security Council is at stake. We call upon the membership of the Security Council to demonstrate solidarity to counter the lawlessness of Washington, which is willing to countenance any sacrifice in any region for the advancement of its geopolitical ambitions. The U.S. government has no concern either for the lives of the people of Gaza nor the views of its own people who are increasingly vocal in their support of the Palestinian people. We should like to hope that within other UN member states and the member states of the Security Council, that they generally listen if not to at least the voice of conscience, but at least to public opinion. Public opinion will no longer forgive United Nations inaction. The situation in the south of the Strip around the city of Rafah is, in the context of Israeli military plans, extremely dangerous. The implementation of these plans will result in a catastrophic increase in the magnitude of the humanitarian disaster, at the epicenter of which are more than 1 million residents of Gaza who have fled hostilities in the city to the border with Egypt. There is a need to do everything possible to prevent this kind of a development. Our shared objective is to stop the bloodshed as soon as possible and to provide conditions for the establishment of sustained channels for the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people in the Strip. We urge the Security Council membership to vote in support of the Algerian draft. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement. I shall put the draft resolution to the vote now. Will those in favor of the draft resolution contained in document S/2024/173 please raise their hand? Those against? Abstentions? The result of the voting is as follows: 13 votes in favor, 1 vote against, 1 abstention. The draft resolution has not been adopted owing to the negative vote of a permanent member of the Council. I now give the floor to those members of the Council who wish to make statements after the vote. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President. Colleagues, over the past few weeks, we have made incredibly clear that the resolution before the Council would not achieve the goal of a sustainable peace and may in fact run counter to it. Proceeding with a vote today was wishful and irresponsible. And so while we cannot support a resolution that would put sensitive negotiations in jeopardy, we look forward to engaging on a text that we believe will address so many of the concerns we all share, a text that can and should be adopted by the Council, so that we can have a temporary ceasefire as soon as practicable, based on the formula of all hostages being released. This temporary ceasefire is critical to getting aid into the hands of Palestinian civilians who desperately need it. We should look towards this text so that we can finally condemn Hamas for their horrific attacks on October 7th, which set this conflict into motion, so that we can empower Senior Coordinator Cog and the United Nations, because her success is the UN success. And it is so very needed to ensure civilians get the aid that they need more efficiently and effectively, and just more, period. And so that ultimately we can together help create a future in which Israelis and Palestinians live in states of their own, side by side, in peace. We're committed to engaging constructively on our resolution with you all in the days to come to that end, and we will continue to tirelessly engage in direct diplomacy and negotiations on the ground. Thank you.
Representative of the United States for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, China expresses its strong disappointment by and dissatisfaction with the outcome of the vote just taken. We have voted in favor of the draft resolution. Algeria, on behalf of the Arab states, put forward the draft resolution demanding a immediate ceasefire in Gaza, immediate release of all hostages, guaranteed access for humanitarian supplies, and opposition to forced transfers. This is both urgently required by the situation on the ground, and it is also based on the minimum requirements of humanity, and it should deserve the support by all Council members. Algeria, by displaying reason, sincerity, and open attitude, held lengthy and extensive consultations with all parties on the draft resolution and took on board many constructive ideas, making the draft resolution more balanced. The outcome of today's vote clearly shows that on the issue of a ceasefire to halt the fighting in Gaza, it is not that the Security Council does not have an overwhelming consensus, but rather it is the exercise of the veto by the United States that has stifled the Council consensus. The U.S. veto sent a wrong message, pushing the situation in Gaza into a more dangerous one. While the Security Council ceasefire resolution is being vetoed, innocent civilians in Gaza are dying in the fighting, and they are struggling on the brink of death. The U.S. claimed that the Council resolution would interfere with the ongoing diplomatic efforts. Such a claim is totally untenable. Given the situation on the ground, the continued passive avoidance on an immediate ceasefire is nothing different from giving a green light to the continued slaughter. While the Security Council ceasefire resolution is being vetoed, the spillover of the conflict is destabilizing the entire Middle East region, leading to a rising risk of a wider war. Only by extinguishing the flames of war in Gaza can we prevent the fires of hell from engulfing the entire region. The Council must act quickly to stop this carnage in the Middle East. While the Council ceasefire resolution is being vetoed, the basics of international law are being trampled upon, and the bedrock of the multilateral system is being eroded. The Secretary General of the United Nations has already written to the Council invoking Article 99 of the Charter, and the International Court of Justice has issued provisional measures. The Council must respond forcefully to the serious violations of the international law and the international humanitarian law in the Gaza conflict and uphold the authority of international rule of order. Madam President, the Security Council must take actions to push for a ceasefire. This should not be a matter of debate, but rather this is a moral obligation that the Council cannot shy away. It is a legal responsibility that the Council must assume. Even more so, this is a political requirement that the Council must fulfill in accordance with the Charter. The veto cannot muffle the strong call for a ceasefire and an end to the war. The Security Council cannot stop its work to uphold justice and fulfill its responsibilities just because of the veto. China urges Israel to heed the call of the international community, abandon its plan for Rafah offensive, and stop its collective punishment of the people of Palestine. We expect countries having significant influence to do less of their political calculations, to be truly impartial and responsible, and to make the right choice in pushing for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on the international community to pool all diplomatic efforts to give the people of Gaza a chance to live and give the people of the entire Middle East region a chance to have peace and give it a chance for justice to be upheld. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We voted for the resolution because the killing of civilians in Gaza must stop. The suffering that Palestinians are enduring is beyond anything a human being should be subjected to. A possible Israeli ground offensive in Rafah would have unimaginable humanitarian consequences. It would push us on a path of no return. It is our duty to react before we wake up in a nightmare. And that's why we are convinced it is high time for the Council to pull a brake. Let me emphasize once again that Slovenia condemns the horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on 7 October, as well as their continuing attacks on Israel. We continue to call for immediate and safe release of all hostages. We feel the pain of their relatives and loved ones. And we thank the leaders of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States for their tireless efforts, and we hope that negotiations they are facilitating will soon bring peace to Gaza and return the hostages home safely. However, it is the responsibility of this Council to maintain international peace and security. We believe that everyone can and should contribute their piece of the puzzle that will eventually bring peace. We believe in complementarity of all efforts, bilateral, regional, or those of the Council. The Council's role is important, and it is indispensable in order to end hostilities, to bring hostages home, to rapidly and safely deliver humanitarian assistance, and to draft a day-after roadmap. Lastly, the Council has a responsibility towards the international community. Its expectations have been clearly expressed through a General Assembly resolution with the overwhelming support of Member States. It has been clearly manifested by citizens across the globe. Their voices are loud and clear. The war needs to stop. The Security Council needs to hear these voices of global consciousness and respond to their demands and pleas. And it all starts with a call for a ceasefire, to end hostilities, to bring hostages home, to bring water and food to starving Palestinians, and to silence and clear the skies over Gaza and Israel. A call addressed to both sides, Israel and Hamas. It is our firm belief that Algeria proposed a balanced text calling for respect of international humanitarian law and human rights law, addressing all violations committed by both sides of the conflict, and calling for accountability for those violations. It is putting protection of civilians as a civilized norm in the center of our action. We therefore deeply regret that the Council was not able to pass this resolution, which we supported strongly. But we cannot give up. It is our responsibility to continue working towards a consensus in this body for peace in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Madam Chair. Switzerland voted in favor of the draft resolution and regrets that it was not adopted despite the very broad support it enjoys among the members of this Council. I would like to thank the Algerian delegation for its efforts in building consensus around this text, which calls in particular for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza and the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held captive in Gaza since the acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas on October 7. Almost 3 weeks have passed since the first draft of this text was submitted. Switzerland welcomed the intense negotiations taking place in the region and stressed the need to give them the necessary time to reach a result. At the same time,
we stress the responsibility of this Council to act in accordance with its mandate for the respect of international humanitarian law and especially the protection of civilians. We regret that a firmer and more explicit condemnation of Hamas's acts of terror was not included in the resolution, despite the injunctions of several Council members, including Switzerland. However, the need to protect the civilian population in Gaza is growing day by day. Respect for international humanitarian law and human rights, particularly as regards the protection of civilians, must remain a priority for this Council. Under the Geneva Conventions, the delivery of humanitarian aid must be safe, rapid, and unimpeded. We cannot allow hundreds of thousands of besieged civilians to be left prey to famine and epidemics without adequate guarantees of security for the delivery of humanitarian assistance and for their own protection. In addition, Switzerland is very concerned about the risk of a large-scale military operation in Rafah and the subsequent regional escalation it could entail. The draft resolution was therefore intended as a preventative measure against further escalation on the spot, which would endanger the lives of all civilians, including the hostages. This is why the call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza is in line with our collective commitment to respect and ensure respect for the Geneva Conventions and international humanitarian law in all circumstances. Switzerland remains committed to unified action by the Council in this direction. We also recall that the parties are obliged to respect the two previous Council resolutions on this subject. And we would also recall the mandatory nature of the provisional measures ordered by the International Court of Justice on 26 January. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madam Chair, France thanks Algeria for preparing and proposing this resolution. It regrets that the resolution was not adopted given the disastrous situation on the ground. The immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, specifically and explicitly requested by Resolutions 2712 and 2720 of our Council, as well as the draft that was just rejected, should take place without further delay. There is extreme urgency to, without further delay, conclude an agreement on a ceasefire that would finally guarantee the protection of all civilians and a massive delivery of emergency aid. The human toll and the humanitarian situation in Gaza is intolerable, and Israeli operations must stop. It's urgent to massively deliver humanitarian aid to the Gaza population. It's imperative to open the Ashdod port and open a land path directly between Jordan through all points of passage. It's also incomprehensible and unacceptable that this Council still has not condemned the terrorist acts committed by Hamas on 7 October with other terrorists and sexual violence used as a weapon of war by these terrorists. We strongly deplore this situation and call upon the Council to rapidly clear itself of this ambiguous guilt. France reiterates its attachment to Israeli security and will continue to resolutely be committed to full mobilization of this Council on all aspects of this crisis: security, humanitarian, and also political. We recall that only a two-state solution can possibly meet the needs of security for Israel and the Israeli people, as well as the legitimate aspiration of the Palestinians to a state. It involves the creation of a Palestinian state that would live in peace and security alongside Israel. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, I wish to begin by expressing our gratitude to the Presidency of Guyana for having convened this meeting to take action on this important resolution on the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We also express our sincere appreciation to Algeria for the tireless work that led to the tabling of the resolution aimed at ending the totally unacceptable and unbearable suffering of the Palestinian people, the humanitarian catastrophe currently unfolding in Gaza. Madam President, by voting in favor of this Security Council resolution, Mozambique aligns herself with the international community as a whole in its effort that overwhelmingly calls for the immediate cessation of hostilities in the Gaza Strip. We consider it imperative that all parties scrupulously comply with their obligations under international humanitarian law and international law, human rights law, in particular with regard to the protection of civilians and civilian infrastructures. We strongly call for the total and full compliance with the provisional measures laid down by the order of the International Court of Justice within the scope of Articles 2 and 3 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, handed down on January 26, 2024. Throughout history, we had our share of painful experience with war and armed conflict. It is on this basis and on the dictates of the laws of war that we embrace that Mozambique firmly opposes the forced displacement of the Palestinian civilian population, women and children in particular. In that connection, we strongly appeal for the full implementation of the United Nations Security Council resolutions 2712 of 2023 and 2720 also of 2023. In the same vein, Mozambique demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, as well as a guarantee of humanitarian access to meet the medical needs of all hostages. Mr. President, Madam President, we urge the international community and the Security Council in particular to continue working tirelessly together towards achieving peace and stability in the region based on a two-state solution for the people of Palestine and Israel. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. The Republic of Korea voted in favor of the resolution proposed by Algeria, considering the urgent need for a humanitarian ceasefire to end the suffering of civilians in Gaza. Right now in Rafah, where more than half of the entire population of Gaza is densely packed, people are panicking at a looming catastrophe that may be caused by a full-scale ground operation. The Republic of Korea could not ignore the possibility of another humanitarian calamity that will lead to a huge number of fatalities. Nonetheless, we adhere to our position that the heinous terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October is the direct cause of the current disaster in Gaza. Thus, it is regrettable that a clear and unified condemnation of the deplorable terrorist acts perpetrated by Hamas was missing in the draft resolution. Madam President, the Republic of Korea takes note that serious negotiations among key stakeholders, namely Egypt, Qatar, US, and Israel, are vigorously ongoing on the ground to achieve the long overdue release of the hostages. We express our strong support and appreciation for these efforts. The Republic of Korea will continue to engage in Council deliberations actively and constructively to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza, as well as the realization of the two-state solution. I thank you.
Representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. It has been over 4 months of devastation, hostilities, and suffering since Hamas' horrifying acts of terror against Israel. We are witnessing an alarming escalation of violence and unimaginable humanitarian catastrophe. The situation on the ground is only worsening as each day goes by. Particularly, the situation in Rafah is deeply concerning. Japan appreciates the ongoing tireless diplomatic efforts led by US and other countries towards the release of hostages, improving the humanitarian situation, and calming down the situation as soon as possible. Japan believes that humanitarian ceasefire needs to be realized promptly in such a way to ensure a conducive environment for sufficient humanitarian assistance activities, as well as to lead to the release of the remaining hostages, therefore resulting in realization of a sustainable ceasefire. Based on this position, we call on all the parties concerned to act immediately from a humanitarian viewpoint. In this vein, Japan voted in favor of this draft resolution. We would like to express our gratitude to Algeria for their efforts to coordinate various positions among the Council members. At the same time, in efforts to ensure a more fair and balanced text, the resolution should have included a condemnation of Hamas terrorist attacks, which the Security Council has so far failed to speak out. Though we couldn't agree on a resolution which all the Council members can support, we are all engaging seriously to stop the violence. This Council should be a place to explore and find a peace and security jointly, not a place to aim for finger-pointing. Japan will continue to work constructively with other Council members to find a path forward for peace and stability in the region. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. Malta also thanks Algeria for their measured and constructive approach as penholders throughout the negotiations. Malta voted in favor of this draft, and we unequivocally reiterate our call for a permanent ceasefire. It is therefore regrettable that the use of the veto prevents this Council from calling for an end to this conflict. We also believe that the Council has provided the ongoing negotiations taking place on the ground the necessary space and time. However, regrettably, we still find ourselves on the precipice of another wave of hostilities. This will undoubtedly have catastrophic consequences on the civilian population in Rafah, an area already designated as a safe zone. We also reject and denounce any forced displacement of the Palestinian civilian population from and within Gaza. Such actions amount to grave breaches of international law. The severely deteriorating humanitarian conditions and the threat of famine within Gaza are extremely troubling and need to be urgently addressed. Israel is required to facilitate the full, rapid, safe, and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza. At the same time, UNRWA remains essential to ensure an effective humanitarian response. The broader regional situation also continues to be deeply worrying. Under these circumstances, the full and immediate implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720 is now more pressing than ever. Let us be clear, this Council has the duty and responsibility to make sure that its decisions are respected. We also echo the call for the remaining hostages to be immediately, safely, and unconditionally released, and we call on this Council to denounce the terrorist acts of October 7th. In closing, President, Malta underlines its unwavering commitment to a comprehensive peace based on the two-state solution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. We want to see the fighting in Gaza end as soon as possible in a way that never again allows Hamas to carry out the appalling terrorist attacks against Israel we saw on the 7th of October last year. Palestinian civilians are facing a devastating humanitarian crisis. We're particularly worried about the situation in Rafah, where a military operation could have appalling consequences for civilians sheltering there with nowhere else to go. Ongoing negotiations are critical to secure the release of the hostages held in Gaza. We are calling for an immediate suspension in fighting to get aid in and hostages out, leading to a permanent, sustainable ceasefire. That means the release of all hostages, the formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package, removing Hamas's capacity to launch attacks against Israel, Hamas no longer in charge of Gaza, and a political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway towards a two-state solution. President, we welcome the efforts of our Algerian colleagues on this resolution, and we regret that some of our proposals were not taken on board. Simply calling for a ceasefire, as this resolution does, will not make it happen. Indeed, as it could endanger the hostage negotiations, it could actually make a ceasefire less likely. The way to stop the fighting and potentially stop it from restarting is to begin with a pause to get hostages out and aid in. That is what we are calling for. It could end the fighting now. We will continue to work for a stop to fighting, a humanitarian response at scale, the release of all hostages, and the delivery of the two sovereign states of Israel and Palestine that ensures peace, security, and justice for both countries. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, the delegation of Sierra Leone would like to thank Algeria for proposing and facilitating efforts to agree to a resolution that would have, inter alia, led to an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. We further thank the Algerian delegation for leading a reasonable, transparent, and inclusive process. Sierra Leone voted in favor of the draft resolution because of the imperative for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The Security Council is mandated to act promptly and effectively in order to maintain international peace and security. The Council has had its attention called to the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza and for it to act under Article 99 of the UN Charter by the Secretary General. Some members of the Security Council have had the opportunity to visit both Rafah crossing from the Egyptian border and Israel, including representatives of the delegation of Sierra Leone. The assessment therefrom has been that only a humanitarian ceasefire will put an end to the unbearable killings in Gaza, and certainly the looming and unthinkable catastrophe in Rafah. Sierra Leone appreciates and commends member states embarking on diplomatic engagement with parties to the conflict to secure a prolonged pause to the hostilities. But while we do so, we remain worried that reaching a meaningful conclusion in practical terms takes time, a luxury that cannot be afforded by the suffering Palestinian people, the families of the hostages, and the hostages themselves. The other main organs of the United Nations have acted timeously and effectively in this tragic conflict. The UN General Assembly has adopted resolutions ES 1021 and ES 1022, with the overwhelming majority demanding in the latter an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The Secretary General of the UN invoked Article 99 of the UN Charter, last used over half a century ago, to warn us in this Council of the humanitarian catastrophe we now see in Gaza. As Council members, we were urged to demand an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. The International Court of Justice has acted promptly and rightly when called upon to do so by South Africa. Following the requests for an indication of provisional measures, the ICJ, in its 26 January 2024 order, in the application of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in the Gaza Strip, South Africa versus Israel, inter alia specifically ordered, and I quote, that the State of Israel shall take immediate and effective measures to enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, end of quote. The court deemed it necessary to emphasize that all parties to the conflict in the Gaza Strip are bound by international humanitarian law. It expressed its grave concern that the fate of the hostages abducted during the attack in Israel on 7 October 2023 and held since then by Hamas and other armed groups, and calls for their immediate and unconditional release. The ICJ further reminded the parties that the provisional measures ordered under Article 41 of the ICJ statute have binding effect and thus create international legal obligations for any party to whom the provisional measures are addressed. Sierra Leone is of the view that in the absence of any prima facie change in the current perilous humanitarian conditions prevailing in Gaza, coupled with the continuing perpetuation of the hostage situation following the 26 January 2024 order of the ICJ, the UN Security Council is now more than ever compelled to act, to use the myriad of tools available to us as a Council to save human lives and put a check on the mounting death toll and inordinate destruction of civilian objects. Madam President, it is extremely worrisome that after over 130 days in the conflict, a draft resolution calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, demanding the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, rejecting forced displacement of the Palestinians, reiterating the call for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access into Gaza, and the optimal political solution of a two-state solution could not be adopted, which we deeply regret. At this stage, with the immense suffering, death, and anguish in Gaza, the Security Council must not relent until a complete halt to the continuing hostilities in Gaza Strip and in the West Bank is achieved. To do otherwise is to accept passively the prevalent criticisms of dysfunctionality of this Council. Meanwhile, the reality in Gaza is that of famine-like conditions, malnutrition, displacement, and the spread of infectious diseases, and the potential for spillover of the conflict in the wider region. Our failure to act extinguishes hope, the hope that 1.3 million Palestinians in Rafah have supplicated to us, and beyond this, the hope that humanity has placed in us as members to deliver on the Council's mandate. This must awaken our resolve to act. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone sincerely looks forward to not only having a positive outcome from the ongoing diplomatic negotiations being mediated by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, but also as a Security Council will have a product that will call for full and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire and release of all hostages. This, we hope, will lead to an end in the fighting and alleviate the humanitarian crisis in the Gaza Strip. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Señora.
Madam Chair, I would like to thank Algeria for the draft resolution that was introduced. Ecuador voted in favor of it, given that it believes that the Council needs to take a stand on the humanitarian situation, which is constantly unraveling with thousands of innocent victims. The draft that we just voted on was not perfect and included in it all the issues that we think were appropriate, but it was presented after a negotiations process that included the necessary elements about a situation which is deteriorating minute by minute. Mainly, it requests a humanitarian ceasefire that would make it possible to alleviate the situation for the civilian population. And it also demands the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, and it deplores the violence against civilians and all acts of terrorism, including, implicitly, the horrific acts committed by Hamas in October of last year. However, it's worth mentioning that Ecuador, like several members of the Council, insistently required that the text have an explicit condemnation of the terrorist actions of Hamas. And we regret that it was not included in the text. That condemnation was not there. However, we think it's important to clearly signal the responsibility that is evident of all those present and also point to the responsibilities that will be seen in future. Ecuador, Madam Chair, regrets at this time that it was not possible to adopt a resolution, and it will continue working so that the Council can take a stance and act effectively through successful adoption. Thank you.
The representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, distinguished colleagues, today we have borne witness to yet another dark chapter in the history of the United Nations Security Council. This was yet again written by the United States delegation, the U.S. delegation which continues to pursue the same objective, to provide cover for its closest Middle East ally and to drag out the time to the greatest possible extent for them to be able to carry out their inhumane plans against Gaza, specifically to expel the Palestinians from the Strip and to completely cleanse the Strip, essentially and quite literally transforming it into an uninhabitable territory. Under these circumstances, there are open discussions in Israeli political circles about categories which completely rule out the two-state solution. Once again, having pitted calls for calling an end to the carnage in Gaza against demands to condemn the actions of Hamas. In doing so, our U.S. colleagues have once again hypocritically remained silent about the fact that on the 18th of October, they, having already vetoed the Brazilian draft resolution with this condemnation. The Algerian draft was capable of reversing this situation, of ending the annihilation of Palestinians in Gaza. Unfortunately, the now fourth U.S. veto prevented this from happening and doomed the fates of another thousands of peaceful citizens of Gaza. However, everybody needs to understand that this result is not the failure in the work of the UN Security Council, which today was effectively united. Rather, this is the pernicious policy of a single member of the Security Council, namely the United States. Full responsibility for the consequences of this lies with Washington, regardless of its attempts to elude this responsibility, expatiating on its quote-unquote important mediation efforts. Regardless of how bitter the aftertaste of today's meeting may be, we have no intention of throwing in the towel. The demand from the UN Security Council for the parties to immediately adopt a ceasefire remains imperative. Absent this, any council product will be devoid of practical purpose. We all had an opportunity to see this based on the example of the toothless humanitarian resolutions on Gaza that the Council had previously adopted. And these remained letters on paper because, as we warned, amid circumstances of active hostilities, it is impossible to deliver humanitarian assistance or to monitor humanitarian pauses. Now, turning to the U.S. text, which previously today was so proactively championed by the United States representative, as far as we are aware, this text has not even been officially circulated at the Security Council, not to mention the fact that there was no comprehensive or meaningful discussion thereof. For this reason, for now, this all looks like further spoilers which are designed to detract attention from the latest shameful veto exercised by the U.S., veto on a critically significant resolution for a ceasefire in Gaza. We call on the membership of the Security Council not to be misled by the duplicitous admonitions that there is a need to wait just a little bit longer. The United Nations Security Council in the world waited for 5 months, and with each passing hour that we wait, there are more and more human victims. The U.S. draft does not contain, I emphasize this, does not contain a call for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. The text refers only to a temporary, and even this when the conditions are ripe. So there is no real alternative to the Algerian draft resolution which the U.S. vetoed. This brainchild is no viable alternative and cannot be any viable alternative to that. This is yet another bad faith attempt by Washington to drag out the time for the purposes of advancing Israel's benefit, interest, and allowing it to definitively resolve the Palestinian question. Our shared objective is to prevent this from taking place and to achieve a just peace between the Palestinians and Israel on the basis of Security Council resolutions and General Assembly resolutions. Let us resolve this together, and perhaps our U.S. colleagues will at some point have their conscience awakened. Thank you.
Representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Madam President. Sayyida Ra'i.
Madam President, allow me at the outset to express my appreciation to all the members of the Security Council for constructively participating in the negotiations. Allow me also to thank all states that voted for and not against the draft resolution. I also thank those who abstained, because this draft resolution calls mainly for a ceasefire in Gaza. The draft resolution would have sent a strong message to Palestinians, saying that the world is not standing idly by their suffering. However, However, and unfortunately, the Security Council failed once again to rise to the calls and aspirations of peoples of the world. This failure does not absolve the Security Council of shouldering its responsibilities. This failure does not absolve the international community of its obligations vis-à-vis the unarmed Palestinian people. This failure does not absolve the occupation power of its obligation to implement the precautionary measures ordered by the International Court of Justice. It is high time for the aggression to end. It is high time for humanitarian assistance to be delivered across Gaza. It is clear that resolutions 2712 and 2720 did not achieve their objectives. It is clear that assistance did not meet the basic needs of the Palestinian people. We have to acknowledge that only a ceasefire can achieve the desired objective. Madam President, the current situation requires everyone, as stressed by the Algerian President, His Excellency Abdelmajid Tebboune, to work on putting the purposes and principles of the United Nations first, to provide the necessary protection to the Palestinian people and to put an end to their historic injustice. Madam President, the people of our region have always looked up to the Security Council as the source of international legitimacy. However, and unfortunately, the Security Council has failed them once again. Our message to you today is that the international community should respond to the calls for ending the killing of Palestinians by calling for an immediate ceasefire. All those impeding such calls should review their policies and their calculations, because wrong decisions today will have a cost on our region and our world tomorrow. And this cost will be violence and instability. So ask yourselves, examine your conscience. What will your decisions today cause? How will history judge you? Madam President, before I conclude, I would like to tell everyone that we will bury our martyrs this evening in Rafah, in Gaza, in all Palestine, and that Algeria will return tomorrow on behalf of the Arab world, on behalf of Muslim countries, and on behalf of all the free people in the world. Powered by the souls of thousands of innocent people killed by the Israeli occupation, with no accountability whatsoever. Algeria will return to knock on the doors of the Security Council once again to call for putting an end to the bloodshed in Palestine. We will not stop until this council shoulders its responsibilities in full and imposes an immediate ceasefire. We will never tire, and we will never stop. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. Colleagues, Guyana is disappointed that this council has once again been unable to deliver a ceasefire for the people of Gaza. A ceasefire is the difference between life and death for the hundreds of thousands of Palestinians and others trapped in the war zone that Gaza has become. The delegation of Algeria has approached the tabling of this resolution with great patience, transparency, and inclusivity. They have listened to all sides, acquiescing to requests for additional time to be given to other efforts underway. It has been almost 3 weeks since the draft was circulated, and we still find ourselves at square one. In that time, almost 2,000 more Palestinians were killed in Gaza, another 2,000 more injured. In those 3 weeks, every aspect of life in Gaza has gotten worse. Internal displacement has increased, with a serious crisis underway in Rafah. Food insecurity continued to worsen, with the latest Integrated Food Security and Nutrition Phase Classification, IPC, report stating that Gaza now has the highest share of persons facing devastating levels of acute food insecurity that the IPC has ever classified for any given area or country. The humanitarian situation has been described as increasingly severe. Humanitarian access is extremely limited, and people's desperation has led them to looting aid trucks to secure a morsel of food. The population is in dire straits. The most vulnerable among them, including children, the elderly, and people with underlying conditions, are especially vulnerable to malnutrition. And all of this is happening in freezing temperatures. In that time, we have also seen a further hardening of positions for the worse. For example, we have heard the determination of the Israeli government to proceed with a ground operation in Rafah, despite the strong urgings to the contrary by many of its friends and partners and others in the international community. We know what a ground operation in Rafah would mean for the people who were driven there by the Israeli Defense Force. The ICJ orders of 26th of January are being completely ignored, as though there is no obligation to adhere to them. UN personnel are continuing to operate in Gaza under these extremely dangerous circumstances, with unprecedented numbers of them killed since 7th of October. Deconfliction mechanisms are not being respected, so everyone is at risk and nowhere is safe. Dear colleagues, what else needs to happen to act for the people in Gaza? How many more lives must be lost? How many more must be maimed? How many more? We need a ceasefire now. Resolutions 2712 and 2720 cannot be fully implemented if there is no ceasefire. The longer we take to agree on the need for a ceasefire, the longer this Council will be seen as being complicit in what is taking place in Gaza. To be clear, Guyana also calls for the release of all hostages taken on October 7th and Palestinians unlawfully detained in Israeli prisons without trial. Though progress has been stalled for decades, the two-state solution still remains the best option for a permanent and lasting resolution of the Palestinian question. The current situation in Gaza puts the two-state solution at great risk, especially given the rhetoric from some Israeli government officials. Guyana calls on this Council to act now for Gaza and for the future of both Palestine and Israel. A peaceful and stable Israel depends on a peaceful and stable Palestine. The two are not mutually exclusive. And a peaceful Palestine and Israel is crucial for lasting peace and stability of the Middle East region. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, we thank you and your friendly country, Guyana, for your leadership of the Security Council. We thank Algeria for all its efforts and its statement that my brother Ammar delivered a few minutes ago in bringing forth the draft resolution on behalf of the Arab group that has just been voted regarding the grave situation that continues to be faced by the Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip as Israel, the occupying power, carries on with its genocidal war. We also thank the 13 members of the Security Council who voted in favor of the draft, and we thank you also for your intense engagement with the Arab group led by our brother, the Ambassador of Algeria, during the course of the last 3 weeks, negotiating in good faith, of trying to save the Palestinian people's lives in the Gaza Strip and not to allow the looming catastrophe flying over our heads in having a further catastrophe on the Gaza Strip. We sincerely thank you for that effort, for your principled position, and for your determination that a ceasefire has to be demanded, implemented now to save lives, to save the Gaza Strip, to save the 1.5 million Palestinians in the Rafah district. This draft resolution was brought to the Council precisely because Israel persists with the onslaught, persists with every single grave breach it has been committing, despite the near unanimous calls by the international community for a ceasefire, and despite the ICJ provisional measures ordered to Israel to cease all acts of genocide and incitement to genocide, and to ensure humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people, who every day are facing death and destruction and the torment of starvation and repeated forced displacement. It has been nearly 3 weeks since I last addressed the Council following the Court's order appealing for action to be taken to ensure the implementation of the provisional measures, to ensure a ceasefire that would protect the Palestinian people and avert the further ravaging of their lives by the Israeli onslaught. But our appeals have regrettably been to no avail. Between our last Council session on the 31st of January and today, the casualty toll has risen from 26,000 Palestinians killed by the Israeli occupying forces to now almost 30,000 people killed and more than 69,000 people injured. This means that in just the past 20 days alone, Israel has killed nearly 4,000 more Palestinian children, women, and men in just 20 days. This is a deplorable consequence of inaction. It means more than 200 Palestinians killed every day. It means that by the time this Security Council session ends, more than 25 Palestinians will have been killed. It means more babies will be murdered, wounded, amputated, and orphaned. More children will die of hunger and hypothermia and disease. It means the continued threat of the further forced displacement of families, the looming danger of a mass expulsion or worse, slaughter of the nearly 1.5 million people in Rafah who have nowhere to flee, no protection whatsoever. It means the continued deprivation of the entire population of Gaza, left without food, water, medicine, and shelter, essential to alleviate suffering and ensure survival. It means that the human lives that could have been spared and saved are instead being forsaken to Israel's genocidal war machine, deliberately, knowingly, by those who oppose a ceasefire. We all know this. We know the staggering figures. We have heard the warning from the Secretary General, the heads of all UN agencies on the ground, dozens of independent special rapporteurs and humanitarian and human rights agencies the world over. We have seen it with our own eyes in pictures and videos that have seared and stained our collective conscience and broken our hearts and our humanity. In the face of Israel's brazen violation of the ICJ order, the court sent another warning, issued another decision on 16 February, reminding Israel that it is bound to fully comply with its obligations under the Genocide Convention and all the provisional measures ordered by the court on 26 January. The court also had to remind Israel that its obligations are immediate and should be effective. The call for ceasefire should have been agreed to long time ago. What threshold needs to be crossed for this Council to finally demand a ceasefire? What could be more serious than the crime than genocide? History, as my brother Ammar said, is going to judge the Council harshly. It is already doing so, impairing its credibility and authority in the eyes of people all over the world, perhaps irreparably. But we will not be complacent in this inaction. We have a duty to our people to seek every possible pathway to bring an end to the slaughter, an end to the trauma and terror, an end to the threats to expel them from their land. We will not be silent, and we will act with every legitimate means to uphold our sacred obligations to defend and protect our people and to pursue justice for them. That is why we have come back to the Security Council over and over again, imploring it to act to protect our people. That is why we will not relent in seeking accountability, calling on the Council, the General Assembly, and all states to act in line with the Charter and all obligations under international law without selectivity, without exception. We will not stop demanding accountability for the war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide that Israel is perpetrating against the Palestinian people. But accountability must move beyond words in these chambers. It must mean real consequences for the occupying power for its criminal behavior. To this end, I just have returned around midnight last night from The Hague, where the State of Palestine stood before the ICJ, appealing to the Court for Justice after more than 75 years of Nakba, 56 years of belligerent occupation, 17 years of blockade, and nearly 140 days of vindictive, punitive siege and massacres perpetrated by Israel in Gaza, which is a genocide. What crimes has Israel not committed yet? We have gone to the court along with an unprecedented number of countries to confront the Israeli impunity that has made life a living hell for the Palestinian people, appealing for an immediate and complete end to this illegal colonial occupation and apartheid regime, the root cause of all the ills our people are suffering, including this genocidal war. The court has undertaken its solemn duties, acting swiftly both in response to the case brought by South Africa against Israel under the Genocide Convention and in response to the General Assembly's request for advisory opinion, which we hope will be a true turning point in the quest for accountability and for justice for the Palestinian people. When will the Security Council finally undertake its solemn duties? When will the Council act to demand the ceasefire that has been demanded by the rest of the international community majority for months now? The veto of this draft resolution is not only regrettable after weeks of consultations with every single Council member and after endless patience by the State of Palestine, the Arab states, and nearly the entire international community that for months have demanded a ceasefire. It is absolutely reckless and dangerous against shielding Israel even as it commits the most shocking crimes while exposing millions of innocent Palestinian civilians to its wrath and more untold horrors. It is not Israel that should be protected by the veto. It is Palestinian children, women, and men who must be protected by this Council acting now. Only with a ceasefire can we give a chance for life, for Resolution 2712 and 2720 to be implemented, as the President of the Security Council has indicated correctly. Ceasefire would allow these two resolutions to be implemented for humanitarian assistance to reach the millions of desperate people in need, for UNRWA and other UN agencies to deliver life-saving aid, and a chance for our collective efforts to chart a path for justice and peace. And as long as the Council fails to demand a ceasefire, it will be considered not only derelict in its duties, but an enabler of the most horrific crimes we are witnessing in these days in Gaza. The message given today to Israel with this veto is that it can continue to get away with murder. Israel cannot and should not and will not get away with it. We will not allow it. This veto does not absolve Israel of its obligations, nor of those who shield it. Not here in the Security Council, not in the ICJ, and not anywhere. Even if the Security Council continues to shirk its responsibilities, to be obstructed by the veto of a permanent member over and over, the other organs of the international system are upholding their responsibilities. And one day or another, Palestinian children will not be viewed as a demography threat, but as children with a right to life and to fulfill their hopes and dreams. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the permanent observer of the Observer State of Palestine for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. Since October 7th, this Council has voted upon numerous resolutions constructed around the same flawed theme, the concept of a ceasefire. This word is constantly mentioned in the Security Council, in the General Assembly, and by UN officials and agencies, as if it is a silver bullet, a magical solution to all of the region's problems. For the past 137 days, the only solution discussed on the international stage is this absurd notion of a ceasefire. Will a ceasefire bring home the hostages? Will a ceasefire eliminate Hamas? Will a ceasefire disarm Hezbollah, the Houthis, and all the other Iranian terrorist proxies in our region? Will a ceasefire end the genocidal ambitions of Palestinian terror groups aiming for Israel's annihilation? We're still waiting for President Abbas to condemn the October 7th massacre. What exactly will this silver bullet ceasefire achieve? A ceasefire achieves one thing and one thing only: the survival of Hamas. Exactly the opposite of how it's portrayed. A ceasefire is a death sentence for many more Israelis and Gazans. Supporting a ceasefire means supporting the survival of jihadist terrorists that will continue butchering Israelis and endlessly spilling the blood of innocents. There is a reason, dear colleagues, that the ICJ unanimously and rightly rejected South Africa's attempt to undermine Israel's right to defend itself by calling for a ceasefire. The very idea that Israel would be denied this fundamental right while Hamas would be free to continue its terror and hold hostages is morally unthinkable, because as you know, Hamas is not going to even read your resolutions. So why are some on this council so determined to impose harmful measures that the ICJ refused to take? You all know the answers. Colleagues, a ceasefire is the epitome of a kick the can down the road policy. A A ceasefire today means immunity for baby killers and rapists. It's an easy way to make this problem an issue for another day. With a ceasefire in place, Hamas will regroup, rearm, and their next attempted genocide against Israelis will only be a question of when, not if. Hamas has sworn publicly to commit the atrocities of October 7th again and again and again until Israel is annihilated. So why is the Council, charged with security, is so fixated on aiding these monsters to stay in power? Just yesterday, Israel exposed footage proving that Shiri Bibas and her two children, 4-year-old Ariel and 1-year-old Kfir, were taken to Gaza alive. So tell me, distinguished council members, a 4-year-old and a baby were taken hostage by Hamas, among others, and most of you choose to support a ceasefire? Why do you want to leave them in Gaza? Do you not see how immoral that is? And what kind of precedent this would set for terrorists around the globe? Did you think about baby Kfir when you voted on this resolution? A resolution that would ensure that Kfir, along with 133 other hostages, remain in dark terror tunnels? Did you think about Noa Argamani? Noa's look of sheer horror as she violently separated from her boyfriend Avinoam Or and taken to Gaza on the back of a motorbike has become a symbol of the hostages' plight. In the heart-wrenching video, you can hear Noa screaming and pleading with the terrorists not to abduct her. Noa's mother, Liora, born Chong Hong Lee, a Chinese-Israeli citizen originally from Wuhan, is terminally ill with stage 4 brain cancer. All she asks is that she can hug Noa, her only daughter, one last time before she succumbs to her illness. To my Chinese colleague, I ask you, in the name of Liora Chong Hong Lee, rather than pushing for a harmful ceasefire which will keep Noa in Gaza, I urge you, pressure Hamas to release Noa so that her mother can see Noa one last time before her death. Colleagues, jihadists around the globe see that the body mandated to uphold international security is willing to allow murderous Hamas rapists to continue their reign of terror. Your calls for a ceasefire empower Hamas, giving them hope to stay in power. This does not ensure security, it prevents it. You truly want a ceasefire? Well, Israel also wants a ceasefire. Your children are not the ones that are falling in battle against bloodthirsty terrorists. They are ours. If Hamas survives, it will be our children that Hamas will murder in cold blood again. Israel seeks a ceasefire, but there is only one formula that we are willing to accept. All of our hostages must be released, and Hamas must turn themselves in. Colleagues, the Algerian resolution not only empowers jihadists by calling for a ceasefire, it also fails, again, to condemn Hamas for their heinous crimes. Not condemning Hamas's atrocities has now become a tradition here. It's tragic. Hamas Nazis invaded Israel, deliberately murdering families, raping women and girls, and destroying everything they could get their hands on. They are brutal terrorists who took pride in their barbarism. Yet, not once, not even once, since October 7th, has this Council or any UN body condemned Hamas and their violence. One day, we mentioned history here, when historians studied the reasons why the UN lost its standing and influence, the inability of this organization to condemn terrorists that slaughter children will be one of the driving factors. Mark my words. But the impact of this Council's decisions spread much further than this room. If this council is incapable of condemning Hamas, UN officials feel like they have further legitimacy to whitewash Hamas. Mere days ago, Under-Secretary General Griffith stated that Hamas is not a terrorist group, but a political movement. Is the intentional, brutal murder of hundreds of civilians not terror? Is the systematic rape of women not terror? Is beheading and burning children alive not terror? We all know Hamas is a terrorist organization, yet by staying silent in the face of Hamas's crimes and not condemning them, you allow such lies to perpetuate. Your politicized decision of silence promotes the falsehoods that Hamas can be reasoned with, that they are not the bloodthirsty terrorists that they are. And this is the stance that the UN adopts and promotes. Condemn Hamas as a council, condemn their atrocities, rid this institution of its shame. Do it for the sake of those butchered, for the sake of the hostages, for the sake of morality and truth. It's in your hands. Colleagues, some of you have approached me and asked me why Israel is so critical of the UN and its agencies. The recent event over the past weeks have hopefully made it clearer to you. 1 week ago, Special Rapporteur Albanese libelously stated that the victims of October 7th were not murdered for their identity, but in response to Israel's so-called oppression. This is victim blaming and a clear justification of terror. But for some UN employees, even poisonous words are not enough. Dozens of UNRWA employees took active roles in the October 7th massacre, while many more praised the savage attack. Faisal Ali Musallem El-Naami, an UNRWA social worker, stuffed the body of Jonathan Samirano into a truck to be taken to Gaza. A Hamas data center was located directly underneath UNRWA headquarters in Gaza, connected to UNRWA's power supply, and terror tunnels have been found running underneath various UNRWA facilities, schools, everything. Out of UNRWA's 1,300 employees in Gaza, 12%, I repeat, 12% are members of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and at least 236 of them are active terrorists in these organizations' armed wings. UNRWA has been proven to be an instrumental part of Hamas's terror machine, which makes UNRWA itself a terrorist organization. Yet, rather than take responsibility for the weaponization of this murderous UN agency, Commissioner General Lazzarini has chosen to say that he had no knowledge of Hamas's hold on his own agency. This is blatantly false. Israel exposed terror tunnels under UNRWA schools and supplied evidence of Hamas's exploitation of UNRWA. You can see it in my Twitter account. I personally sent letters to the Commissioner General and the Secretary General. We implored them for years to carry out a comprehensive search of all UNRWA facilities in Gaza. Yet not only did they refuse, they chose to bury their heads in the sand and ignore the reality. This is why every report, every statement or number provided by the UN cannot be trusted. In Gaza, dear colleagues, Hamas is the UN and the UN is Hamas. Distinguished Council members, this ostrich tactic, burying one's head in the sand, is the modus operandi among UN leadership. Yet, no matter how deep one's head is buried, it will not change the reality on the ground. A terrorist is a terrorist. A terror organization is a terror organization. And a law-abiding liberal democracy will remain as such. Even if here at the UN, for political reasons, light becomes darkness and day becomes night. This is also the case with the escalating situation on Israel's northern border with Lebanon. For years, and you heard it here, for years Israel has called for this council to impose the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1701. Yet, for years, the UN has opted for the ostrich tactic. Tragically, This is no longer a situation that can be ignored. The clock is ticking. It is not a matter of years, but weeks before Israel will be forced to implement Resolution 1701 ourselves. Just yesterday, a Hezbollah drone was downed while flying over the Sea of Galilee, deep, deep inside Israel. Over 2,000 Hezbollah missiles and rockets have rained down on the cities of Israel's north. 2,000. And nearly 100,000 residents of northern Israel have been displaced due to the threat posed by Hezbollah, with, of course, Iran's backing. A ceasefire in Gaza is not only destructive for Israel and the Palestinians, it also ensures that a blind eye is turned to what is unfolding in the rest of the region. Be it the Houthis' relentless attacks on maritime trade, pro-Iran militias targeting even American service members, or Hezbollah's constant bombardment of Israel's north. The clock is ticking, and sadly, we will be forced to take decisive action. Terror will never be tolerated. Madam President, this Council must put politics aside for the sake of its mandate. A ceasefire that allows Hamas to remain in power means ensured death and destruction. Ignoring Hamas's atrocities and not condemning them means empowering terrorists worldwide. And focusing only on Gaza while looking away from the terror aggression across the region will lead to a future that none of us seek. The Security Council must fulfill its mandate. It must side with Israel against the forces of evil, and it must face reality. Reality is not found when one's head is buried in the sand. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement. I shall now give the floor to the representative of Qatar.
شكرا لكم السيد الرئيس.
I would like to thank you, Madam President, and I'd like to thank your friendly country on your presidency of the Security Council. It is a pleasure for me to deliver a statement on the behalf of the Arab countries of the Gulf Cooperation Council. My country, the state of Qatar, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, the Sultanate of Oman, and the Kingdom of Bahrain align themselves with the statement to be delivered by the Arab group. Madam President, today's meeting is being held under extremely difficult circumstances. The situation in the Gaza Strip has increasingly deteriorated, and we are facing the worst humanitarian disaster the world has seen. According to UN reports today, there is no safe place in the Gaza Strip. Almost all residents of the Gaza Strip, whose number is more than 2 million, these 2 million people are now refugees and people faced with the risk of starvation. At a time when the aggression by the Israeli occupying power against our Palestinian brethren has been ongoing for 5 months, the GCC has cautioned against the increased frequency of military attacks against our Palestinian brothers. We caution against the increased number of victims, the majority of whom are women and children who have been killed, wounded, and people under rubble. We call on the United Nations to assume responsibility. The UN officials have said that they've never seen a situation such as that taking place today. The UN Secretary General invoked Article 99 of the Charter, warned about the dangers of the collapse of the humanitarian system and of public order in Gaza. He also called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. There's a need to fully implement the resolutions 2720 and 2712 of the Security Council dating 2022. Madam President, the Arab states of the Gulf Cooperation Council condemn in the firmest terms the Israeli threat regarding the launch of a military operation against the city of Rafah. In the city of Gaza, we caution against the fact that these threats portend an increase in violence levels and destabilization. These threats represent a danger to regional stability. We firmly condemn the attempts at forced displacement of civilians, and we firmly reject any military engagement in the city of Rafah. We caution against a new humanitarian disaster in that area. This is the last refuge for hundreds of thousands of displaced persons in the Gaza Strip. In the same vein, we profoundly regret the suspension by some donors of their financing for UNRWA, specifically in the light of the dangerous humanitarian situation which we are all bearing witness to. 5 million Palestinian people depend on the agency, especially in the Gaza Strip. We align ourselves in this regard with what was said by the SG in his call for countries who have halted their support to UNRWA to reconsider and to reinstate their financing for the agency to end the humanitarian disaster in Gaza to prevent it from worsening. Our countries reiterate their steadfast position in support of the just Palestinian cause and the legitimate rights of the fraternal people to establish an independent state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. Madam President, Arab states of the GCC extend their appreciation for the ongoing negotiations around a framework agreement for a new humanitarian truce in Gaza. My country, the state of Qatar, has been facilitating these efforts alongside the Arab Republic of Egypt and the U.S. to free hostages and detainees, to guarantee greater deliveries of humanitarian assistance and to rescue efforts in Gaza to protect civilians. The Arab states of the GCC have profound regrets regarding the failure of the Council to adopt a draft resolution submitted by Algeria. This was supported by the Arab group and the overwhelming majority of members of the Council. This draft is humanitarian by its content and aligns with IHL. We wish to emphasize in this regard that our country will continue efforts alongside partners at all levels to guarantee the achievement of an immediate humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. Let us end the bloodletting of the Palestinian people and let us deliver adequate volumes of humanitarian assistance and relief to Gaza, and let us protect civilians. Thank you very much for your attention.
Of Qatar for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Tunisia.
شكرا السيدة الرئيسة.
Thank you, Madam President. It is my honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Arab group. Allow me at the outset to congratulate you and your country, Guyana, for presiding over the Security Council this month. We thank you for holding this session. We would like to thank Algeria, the Arab member in the Security Council, for taking the initiative to table the draft resolution and make every effort during the negotiations to preserve the unity of the Security Council and reach consensus on a call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. This is the most urgent measure during these catastrophic circumstances in the Gaza Strip and the horrible humanitarian suffering of the Palestinian people. This is caused by the occupation forces' continued aggression, war crimes, genocide against the Palestinian people, which continue unabated. The occupation forces also continue to impose a collective punishment and prevent humanitarian, medical, food, and fuel assistance to be delivered to Gaza. Madam President, the Arab group would like to thank the Council members that positively contributed and constructively participated in the negotiations on the draft resolution and voted for its adoption. At the same time, we regret that the Council failed to adopt the draft resolution. It failed once again to shoulder its moral and legal responsibility as the main organ entrusted with the maintenance of international peace and security. We reaffirm, like other countries and members of the Security Council and UN and humanitarian organizations, the need for an immediate ceasefire, the need to prevent the occupation powers from implementing their schemes which target more than 1.5 million Palestinians in Rafah, the need to prevent yet another forced displacement of Palestinians and emptying of Palestinian land. It is unacceptable by any standard for the Security Council to continue to work at the whim of political calculations and narrow interests at a time where daily attacks continue on Palestinian people, deepening their suffering and killing thousands, including children, women, elderly, and sick people. The Security Council failed today to speak in one voice and put the principles of international law and international humanitarian law and the right to life first. This sends the wrong message once again to the occupying power and gives it a carte blanche to continue its crimes, disregarding international legitimacy and considering itself above the law and above all accountability. It worsens the lack of trust in the credibility of this important UN organ. In this vein, we reject, once again, the policies of favoritism of the occupation schemes and its protection at the expense of thousands of Palestinians who are being killed and their land that is being stolen based on the schemes of displacement and settlement. We reject the double standards that only protract the Palestinian question, that lead to the non-implementation of any relevant resolution. This has caused massacres and abuse of the rights of the Palestinian people. We call for dealing with all situations and questions with the same level of commitment and with the same standards. We call upon the international community and the Security Council to provide protection to Palestinian civilians and accelerate the unimpeded entry and delivery of humanitarian assistance to Gaza in implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2720 and 2712. We fully support the efforts of the UN Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator in Gaza, Sigrid Kaag, and her efforts to address the current catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Strip. Madam President, the current efforts to agree on an exchange of prisoners, detained persons, and on a truce do not go against the call for an immediate ceasefire, because the ceasefire can only facilitate such efforts. Nothing can justify the insistence to reject the draft resolution calling for a ceasefire and allowing the international community and the Security Council to speak in one voice, except the occupation government's attempt to continue its military operations and displace Palestinians. As we see the attempt to steer the Council away and prevent it from shouldering its responsibilities set out in the UN Charter in such catastrophic situations, we cannot help but wonder, what exactly is the role of the Security Council? When will it be allowed to play this supposed role? How many innocent lives should be killed before this actually happens? Are 28,000 people killed, 70,000 injured, and 1.3 million displaced not enough? Is the destruction of all the infrastructure, homes, hospitals, schools, worship places, and UN offices not enough? Is the killing of dozens of UN and humanitarian workers and journalists not enough? Madam President, the Arab group strongly condemns the repeated attacks by the occupation power on Syria and Lebanon and its violation of their sovereignty, the killing of innocent civilians and anything that threatens peace and stability in the region and the world. We will continue to make every effort at all levels and in all fora so that the international community shoulders its responsibilities without any selectivity or political considerations to compel the occupation power to respect the international law and international humanitarian law and end its criminal schemes and blatant violations of the rights of the Palestinian people. Thank you, Madam President.
Tunisia for his statement. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of Egypt to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
Thank you, Madam President. Distinguished members, today morning we have witnessed once again a stark example of double standards. The U.S. delegation, for the third time, has obstructed the adoption by the Security Council of a ceasefire resolution on Gaza, despite 13 votes in favor of the draft resolution submitted by Algeria with full support by the Arab and Islamic groups in the United Nations. We are grateful for Algeria, the Arab member of the Security Council, for putting forward the draft resolution. We are grateful for all those who voted in favor of the draft resolution. Yet the delegation of Egypt expresses its disappointment and frustration as a result of the obstruction by the U.S. of endeavors for ceasefire, by obstructing this main body entrusted with maintenance of international peace and security to assume its duties. Distinguished delegates, where would this U.S. vote stand in the face of the humanitarian suffering that reached the catastrophe level after the 20th week of the war in Gaza? How can we call for a rules-based international order while when we call for the implementation of these rules, we are met only with deaf ears? When the Secretary General of the UN invoked Article 99 of the Charter of the United Nations, wasn't it an indicative of the measure requested from the Security Council? Isn't the ICJ order indicating provisional measures indicative of the urgent need for a ceasefire? The reports from OCHA, WHO, and UNRWA on the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, in particular along the borders with Egypt in Rafah, aren't they enough to convince the U.S. delegation to vote in favor of ceasefire? 140 days after the onslaught of the conflict and after more than 30,000 persons lost their life, women and children, as a result of the war in Gaza. Distinguished delegates, Egypt was the first Arab country to have peace with Israel. Egypt is more keen on the stability of the Middle East region, and Egypt will continue to bear the heaviest brunt politically, security, humanitarianly as a result of the crisis. And despite the failure of the Council, Egypt is committed to work tirelessly to put an end to the bloodshed, to put an end to the destructive war, to restore political horizon, to achieve the aspirations of the Palestinian and Israeli peoples in peace and stability in line with international legitimacy resolutions, with the establishment of the independent Palestinian state along the lines of June 1967 with East Jerusalem as its capital. Mr. President, Egypt negotiates and mediates meaningfully and seriously in coordination with the U.S., Qatar, Israel, and Palestine to expeditedly release the Palestinian hostages and to deliver humanitarian aid at scale to put an end to the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza, to save the Palestinian brothers from the unjust siege imposed on them by the Israeli occupying power, and to stand in the face of all attempts by Israel to impose forced displacement on the Palestinian people, to liquidate the Palestinian cause. Egypt calls on the Security Council and all responsible international powers to save the choice for peace by immediate implementation of ceasefire. This will not impede the ongoing mediation efforts, but rather will create the conducive conditions for its success. Let us negotiate and mediate in an environment of smooth flow of humanitarian aid and restored calm and healing the wounds of the wounded, instead of negotiating and mediating in an atmosphere of war and destruction caused by the destructive Israeli war machine. Madam President, Egypt's call for all of you is plain and simple. Cease fire now. Let's not mistake this noble and direct message as anything as having political calculations. It aims only at saving the civilians. Egypt warns once again against the catastrophic risks looming against the Palestinian people as a result of the declared plans of Israel to have ground offensive in Rafah, and we warn the international community of the consequences of this destructive war. Thank you, Madam President.
For his statement, the representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement, and I now give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. Earlier, we heard the representative of Israel raising a question to the Chinese delegation. In response, we'd like to say, every life is precious. Every life has the right to be protected. Regarding your reference, the Israeli citizen Noah being detained, her mother was once a national of China. Recently, our diplomats here in New York, at the request of the Permanent Mission of Israel, met with the friends of Noah. Like the friends and family of Noah, we hope she can return home early. In fact, China has never stopped calling for the early release of all those detained. Therefore, we hope that Israel, with the mediation of Egypt and Qatar, there will be progress in negotiating a deal. As we have repeatedly emphasized, collective punishment for the Palestinian civilians is not the right response. It will only be counterproductive. The only way towards the peace between the two countries is the two-state solution to avoid a bigger disaster. The pressing priority is immediate ceasefire. We hope Israel will listen to the overwhelming voice of the international community, and after listening to the voices of the council members and other countries, you should make the correct judgment rather than changing the subject. Thank you.
For his statement, there are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.
You know, every council member, almost every council member will say that in their statements. We think it should be reflected in a resolution, even a humanitarian resolution. And let me just say, every life matters. And so it is important that we find a solution that will stop the killing and deaths and suffering of the Palestinian people. And that's why we're on the ground 24/7. No one else is putting their people out there. No one else is putting skin and boots on the ground to find a solution to this situation. And we'll keep working on that every single day.
Hi, Ambassador. China described your position that the Algerian draft would undermine regional efforts at the hostage deal as completely untenable given the situation on the ground. Explain then, Ambassador, how the Algerian draft would have placed those talks in jeopardy, given that the Algerian text also called for the immediate release of those hostages.
Yes, but they also call for an immediate ceasefire, which would give Hamas the cover of not releasing the hostage. Part of the ceasefire that we're working on requires that they do exactly that, and this resolution did not make that connection. And it was our concern that it would send the wrong message to Hamas, that this resolution, which actually gives them something that they have asked for without requiring them to do something in return, would have meant that the fighting would have continued. Because without the hostage releases, we know that the fighting is going to continue. Thank you all.
أنا طويل فنكون وراك.
احنا طوال انت خلي يبدا رياض. لا تفضل انت الرئيس. شرف.
خش.
كلام عربي ولا انجليزي؟
يعني سوي انجليزي اول شيء.
يلا. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. We found, regrettably, we found ourselves once again with the Security Council incapable of shouldering its responsibilities and its duties in adopting a resolution that calls for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire given the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza. The Arab group will continue its efforts with the international community at all the levels to establish this humanitarian ceasefire. And I'll let my colleague, Dr. Riyad, to say a few words.
Well, thank you very much for being with us. I just want to begin by expressing our gratitude to all of my brothers and sisters of the Arab group, demonstrating, as usual, our total unity in calling for an immediate ceasefire. And also, I want to express our gratitude to my brother from Algeria and his team, and to the Algerian people and their government, who represented us in an impeccable way in the Security Council. And they gave all the necessary time to all members of the Security Council over the course of the last 3 weeks to sincerely and genuinely try to reach an agreement after 140 days to have an immediate ceasefire to save lives and to save the looming catastrophe above our heads in Rafah, in which approximately 1.5 million Palestinians are cramped in that small area to try to save their lives and to stop the Israeli occupying forces from invading Rafah. Regrettably, we are extremely disappointed that a resolution was not adopted in spite of the fact that there was very strong support by 13.5, you can say close to 14 members of the Security Council to that call. And we thought that this massive support in the Council, outside the Council, in the General Assembly, in the Summit of NAM, in the Summit of the Arab countries and the Islamic countries, and in the Summit of the African Union just a few days ago, in which everyone is saying ceasefire, ceasefire now. Even high school students in the city of New York who decided last week to march in the streets out of their schools demanding a ceasefire now, and millions in all corners of the globe. Unfortunately, one country does not see it that way. And if that country has the power to say, as it was announced in the Council, that they want to have a long cessation of hostilities to be able to negotiate what they are negotiating with two of our countries, Egypt and Qatar, the release of prisoners and the hostages, who is stopping them from demonstrating to us through action of stopping the fighting, and then to continue to negotiate whether the Security Council adopt a resolution or not, although it is the charter responsibility of the Security Council, whenever there is conflict, whenever there is war, that the first thing that they should ask for is a ceasefire. Let me also say a few things in Arabic. أنا وصلت البارح مساء منتصف الليل قادما من محكمة العدل الدولية، حيث قدمنا مرافعة دولة فلسطين عبر أكثر من 3 ساعات تحدث فيها 5 من أفضل المحامين في العالم ووزير الخارجية، وأنا شخصيا كان لي شرف أن أتكلم في النهاية لبضعة دقائق لأنقل عذابات وأحاسيس وألم وجرح الشعب الفلسطيني أمام أعلى محكمة في العالم، طالبين الإنصاف والعدالة ووضع حد لمحنة الشعب الفلسطيني وإنجاز حقوقه كاملة. وبطبيعة الحال لأنه حدد في مجلس الأمن أن التصويت سيتم صباح هذا اليوم، فبدلا من أن أمكث وقتا أكثر لأسمع إلى مرافعات الآخرين، عدت إلى نيويورك في الموقع الطبيعي لي مع أشقائي وشقيقاتي المجموعة العربية في مجلس الأمن الذين أبدعوا في طرح الموقف العربي الجماعي اليوم، وبمنتهى الألم وبمنتهى الخطورة كما عبر عن ذلك شقيقي أسامة من مصر المحاذية لقطاع غزة ولفلسطين جغرافيا وسياسة ووجدانا وقلبا، ونحييهم على ذلك. والكلمات القوية التي قالها أخي عمار باسم الجزائر التي تعبر عن عمق مشاعرنا نحن في فلسطين ونقدرها ونشكرهم على ذلك، وكذلك تعبر عن مشاعر وأحاسيس جميع العرب جميعا، وكذلك كلمتنا المشتركة التي ألقاها أخي طارق رئيس المجموعة من تونس، وأختي عالية التي طرحت باسم مجموعة منظمة مجلس التعاون الخليجي. كل ذلك يعني أبرز بشكل لا لبس فيه أنه ليس فقط عندنا إجماعا عربيا قويا حول هذه المسائل وقف إطلاق النار، ولكن الشبه إجماع دولي حول هذه المسألة. وقبل أن تسألوني ما هي الخطوة القادمة، نحن ندرس كل الخطوات ولن نترك مجالا لا لمجلس الأمن ولا للجمعية العامة ولا محكمة العدل الدولية ولا مجلس حقوق الإنسان الذي سيبدأ بعد بضعة أيام. سنبقى نطرق كل الأبواب ومع الملايين في الشوارع في كل مكان في العالم من أجل أن يتوقف هذا العدوان وأن لا يتم مذبحة ونكبة رفح ونكبة أهلنا في غزة، ونتفادى ذلك عبر موقف واضح ورسمي من مجلس الأمن باعتماد ليس فقط قرار لوقف العدوان وإنما تنفيذ وقف العدوان فورا. نشكركم على تواجدكم، أنتم يعني لسان حالنا في أن تعبروا عن هذه المأساة وعن هذا الإخفاق في مجلس الأمن. انقلوه بأمانة ودقة إلى كل أنحاء العالم، لأن نريد من العالم أن يزيد من ضغطه للتوصل إلى وقف إطلاق النار. وشكرا. Okay. 1, 2, 3.
Okay. Can I ask you about, you heard the US ambassador raise it in the meeting. She has a new draft resolution. It does not have the words immediate ceasefire, but it does use the word ceasefire for the first time, and there is one part of that resolution that says the Rafah offensive should not proceed. What is your view of that resolution, and are there parts of it that you can work with?
I think that you should ask her, because it seems to me that you are slightly unclear about exactly what she means. She is more qualified than me to say that. We welcome using ceasefire. She said that to us in closed meeting, call it whatever you want, pauses, ceasefire. She said that to us in closed meeting. It was good that it was said, but more importantly, if they believe in that, who is stopping them from implementing that and influencing Israel to do so? Talal.
معالي السفير، ندرك أنكم ستتجهون إلى جميع المحافل الدبلوماسية بحثاً عن الحل، ليس فقط من خلال مجلس الأمن، ولكن هل الطريق أغلق الآن من خلال المجلس بسبب التعنت الأمريكي والوقوف بصورة غير محايدة تماماً ومنحازة إلى جانب إسرائيل وإصرارهم أنه لا وقف لإطلاق النار حتى التوصل إلى اتفاق حول إطلاق سراح جميع الرهائن؟ وبالنسبة لقطر ومصر إذا أمكن، هل هناك مؤشرات الآن بوجود قادة حماس في القاهرة إلى ربما انفتاح انفراج في الملف. أترك ذلك لكم.
باختصار بالنسبة لنا نحن والجزائر وكل الذين يتحدثوا من العرب لن نقبل أن باب مجلس الأمن قد أغلق. سنبقى نطرق هذا الباب إلى أن يتحمل مجلس الأمن مسؤوليته وأن يتحملها بأسرع وقت ممكن لإيقاف وقف إطلاق النار.
أخ طلال، بالنسبة لسؤالك
مصر
موقف المجموعة العربية إزاء انسداد الأفق أو الطريق في مجلس الأمن، نحن كما أشرت في بداية هذا اللقاء المجموعة العربية لن تتوقف طبعا، وسيكون مجلس الأمن هو الخطوة القادمة في مناسبات متتالية، لأننا نصر على تحميل مجلس الأمن لمسؤوليته التي يقرها الميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقانون الدولي. ولكن نحن ندرك أنه كل ما فات الوقت هناك أرواح تزهق وهناك كارثة تنذر بتعميق معاناة أكثر من 1.5 مليون في رفح. سنتحرك على جميع المستويات وفي جميع المحافل، ولكن سيكون مجلس الأمن دائما نصب أعيننا لأنها مسؤوليته التاريخية والقانونية والأخلاقية أيضا. تفضل.
شكرا أخي طلال. طبعا سؤالك حول المفاوضات الجارية في العواصم، كما تعلمون يعني الجهود اللي تبذلها دولة قطر بالتعاون مع الأشقاء في مصر وبالتعاون مع الولايات المتحدة لم تتوقف، فهي مستمرة للوصول إلى اتفاق لهدنة إنسانية جديدة تسمح بالدرجة الأولى طبعا هي لحقن دماء أشقائنا الفلسطينيين، إطلاق سراح الأسرى المحتجزين في القطاع، وكذلك المحتجزين الفلسطينيين، لأن كما تذكرون الاتفاق الأول احتوى على ذلك وحققنا نجاح كبير فيه. لذا الجهود لا زالت مستمرة، وبالفعل هذه الأيام أيام دقيقة ومهمة للتوصل لاتفاق. سوف نبذل كل ما بوسعنا، يعني الجهود مستمرة. كنا نتمنى اليوم المجلس يتخذ قرار يدفع باتجاه ضغط أكبر على الطرف الإسرائيلي أيضا مما يساعد المفاوضات الجارية. فإحنا ننظر للتحرك في المجلس كدافع للتحرك كذلك في العواصم للتوصل لاتفاق لهدنة إنسانية جديدة. شكرا.
أسامة.
نفس الكلمات، ليس لدي الكثير لأضيفه على ما تفضلت به أختي العزيزة السفيرة علياء. مصر وقطر ملتزمتان وجدتان للغاية في التعامل مع تلك المفاوضات الشائكة. تلك المفاوضات بطبيعتها معقدة ولا يمكن التنبؤ بسرعة تحقيق النتائج، إنما ما نؤكده أن الجهد والعزم أكيد من كل الأطراف في محاولة لتحقيق الاختراق المطلوب، إيقاف نزيف الدماء. وكما تفضلت أختي العزيزة السفيرة علياء، لا انفصال بين قيام مجلس الأمن تحمل واجباته ووقف إطلاق النار، بل على العكس نفضل كما أوضحت في بياننا أن نتفاوض وسط الهدوء، وسط انسياب المساعدات، وسط علاج الجرحى، بدلا من أن نتفاوض تحت الضغط الشديد الذي قد ينذر بالمزيد من تصعيب المفاوضات الصعبة بطبيعتها. وبإذن الله مستمرون.
إيدث.
Thank you very much. Does the Arab group have any plans to take this resolution to the General Assembly for a vote there?
Oh, this is what I meant, that you will be asking that question, and I'm glad that you're asking that question. We have all the options available to us. The resumed emergency session is one serious option. We will decide when to do it, and even if the same language or different language. And also, we are contemplating also the possibility of seeing the representative that casted the veto to address and to defend itself before the General Assembly, which is an automatic thing that could take place within 10 days. All these options are available to us. We will continue meeting as an Arab group and other friends, and we will discuss all these options, and we will decide on the step that we will begin with, but we will not relent until we succeed in having a ceasefire.
So does that mean that we can expect some sooner rather than later action by the Arab group in the General Assembly?
That it's a good assumption, and I think that most likely we will be acting on the basis of your assessment. Let me also add that we in the Arab group, strong defenders of the Secretary General and his principal position in calling for human rights, human ceasefire early in the ball game. And also we salute him for his courage in invoking Article 99 when he came to the Security Council. And also we are defenders of all UN agencies working in the humanitarian field, that they are carrying honorably their mandate, and all of the lies that you heard from one speaker in the chamber are lies and reflecting noise in his head, are not reflecting reality, which is being admired by the entire international community. And such audacity of challenging the Security Council, that he is going to implement 1701, and he is the lover of Security Council Resolution 1701, when he is refusing and attacking every Security Council resolution related to what Israel should do, is beyond the theater of absurd, and you should expose such arrogance and listening to the noise in his head and not listening to the international community and all members of the Security Council when they say what they said. I think that that is worth noting, and it is up to you whether you want to reflect it in your reporting. Although I'm not advising you to waste too much time in that point, but I trust your judgment. Thank you so much.